What if I told you that the people who built America believed debt was more dangerous than disease, more destructive than war, and more terrifying than poverty itself, and that the rules they followed about money were not about getting rich, but about staying free? Because in the 19th century, owing money was not just a financial problem, it was a life sentence that could follow you until death. In the 1800s, there were no credit cards, no student loans, no bankruptcy, protection, and no easy way out, because when you borrowed money, you were not just promising to pay it back. You were promising a piece of your future, and if you failed, the punishment was brutal, because you could lose your land, your home, your tools, and sometimes even your freedom in the form of debtor. Prisons that still existed in many parts of America. Imagine a world where one bad harvest, one failed business, or one medical emergency could push you into a spiral of borrowing that ended with everything you owned being taken away while you still owed more. That fear shaped how Americans thought about money, and it is why they hated debt with a passion that feels strange to us today. Back then, people believed that a man who owed money was not fully free because someone else had power over his time, his labor, and his choices. Parents warned their children never to borrow unless it was absolutely necessary because they had seen families destroyed by it and entire farms lost to lenders who showed no mercy when payments were missed. Farmers were especially vulnerable because their income depended on the weather, and if a drought or flood destroyed their crops, they had to borrow just to survive the winter, and once they borrowed, the lender owned a piece of their life until the debt was repaid, and many times the next year was bad too, and the debt grew until the farm was no longer theirs. This created a quiet tragedy across rural America, where families who had worked the same land for generations were forced to hand it over to banks and wealthy creditors because they could not escape what they owed. That is why Americans saved even when it was hard, and why they lived simply, even when they could afford more. Because a simple life without debt was better than a comfortable life owned by someone else. Even city workers followed this rule because wages were low and jobs were unstable, and owing money meant you could be forced to work for anyone at any wage just to keep your creditors away. Businesses also feared debt because before 1900, most companies grew slowly using profits instead of loans, because borrowing to expand meant risking everything if sales dropped, and failure was not just a setback, it was total ruin. This created a culture of patience and discipline where people planned carefully and avoided risks that could trap them in long-term obligations. Then, as America industrialized and banks grew more powerful, something changed because financial institutions realized they could make far more money if they could convince people that debt was not dangerous but helpful, and that borrowing was not a trap but a tool for a better life. Installment plans allowed people to buy furniture and appliances with small monthly payments, and department stores offered credit accounts. And slowly, Americans were taught that it was normal to buy things they could not yet afford. This was the beginning of a cultural shift that transformed how people thought about money and responsibility. Instead of saving first and buying later, people began buying first and paying later, and this new habit made banks incredibly rich because every payment came with interest, which meant profit. Over time, credit became easier and easier to get, and by the 20th century, debt was no longer something to fear, it was something to use. But what was lost was the old understanding that debt always comes with chains, even if those chains are invisible. Today, most people wake up already owing someone money for their house, their car, their education, and even the food they eat, and they spend their lives working not for freedom but for payments that never seem to end. 19th century Americans would have found this horrifying because they believed that the first step to a good life was owning your future, not renting it from a bank. They knew that debt does not just take money, it takes options, because when you owe, you cannot quit. A bad job, you cannot take risks, and you cannot walk away from something that makes you unhappy. You become trapped by your own promises, and the saddest part is that modern society has been taught to see this trap as normal. People celebrate taking on debt for bigger houses, newer cars, and expensive lifestyles without realizing that each loan is a small piece of their freedom being sold away. The old Americans would have called this madness because they believed that real wealth was the ability to say no to anyone who tried to control you. So ask yourself this: if the people who built America feared debt more than poverty, what do they know that we have forgotten? And are we really as free as we think if most of our lives are spent paying off what we owe? Comment what you think about debt and whether it is a tool or a trap. Like if this story changed how you see money. Subscribe to Finance TED. Official, because the real secrets of wealth are not about getting rich, they are about staying free.